Now on forward, what lies ahead for the U.S. economy and what you and yours should be thinking about doing? Zach and I talk about shootings. Is this time different? And we make summer content recommendations, including Zach's experience as a first-time author this week on Forward. And we are back to talk about the changing world order, my conversation with perhaps the world's greatest investor, certainly on the top 5 or 10 list, Ray Dalio, and what the heck this book actually means. Wow, did I find interviewing Ray Dalio to be edifying and fascinating. And for those of you who missed it, you can check that out, or you can check out the YouTube video that summarizes his new book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Or if you're like me and you want to inhale a 430-page book, you can buy Ray's book. But I came away from this interview with like my worldview having changed.
All right, we were talking about this before we started recording, is that if you're a billionaire and like a very successful, well-known billionaire, right, there's no real point in writing a book from a money or status, prestige situation. So the only reason he's writing it is because he's got something to say. And I feel like if you got a guy like that who's pretty wise, you should probably listen, you know. And given what I've taken away from the book and the podcast, yeah, listen up, y'all. It's crazy.
He felt like a real-life oracle, because check it out. Founds the world's biggest hedge fund that now has over $200 billion under management. I mean, that's literally so like nation-state scale stuff. Personally worth $20+ billion. And it did all this without, frankly, any notoriety. It's like he does not need the spotlight, to your point.
Yeah.
And he talks several times in his book about how it's like, hey, some people aren't going to like this, but, you know, I think it's important to share. Because he knows, frankly, how polarizing everything is and the rest of it. But his big points were that there are 3 mega cycles that the U.S. is going through. And unfortunately, all 3 of them bode ill for our relatively near future. And he talks about this as a world-class investor who's like, look, sometimes the time horizon is longer than your lifetime, but the things can happen in your lifetime, so you have to understand them. And he talks about how early in his career, the U.S. dollar got devalued when they left the gold standard. And he was like, okay, that's new. So that was in the early 70s. And he's very, very concerned that we're doing it again, that we're going through a massive devaluation. And what's interesting is listening to him talk, I heard many, many crypto enthusiasts talking as well, because there are a lot of folks who are into crypto who are like, hey, they're debasing the dollar.
Right.
And one of the things that Ray talks about is that since 1700, 75% of the currencies that were in effect over that time have ceased to exist. That typically a currency goes through this grand arc, and then eventually the currency either stops existing because it doesn't work anymore, or it's been greatly devalued. So he says that 25% of the currencies that are still in effect have been greatly devalued, but 3 out of 4 of them just don't exist anymore.
Well, that's terrifying.
And so he talks about the 6-part cycle of, it's like the mega credit cycle. It takes 50 to 75 years. And one of the things that when I was running for president, this reminded me of, is that back in Sumerian times, you know this word jubilee, jubilation, jubilee?
Yeah.
So that originated...
Ultimate happiness, what does it mean? Ultimate celebration?
Well, that originated as a giant debt forgiveness festival that happened in like ancient times, where the cycle of things that happened was that people started borrowing money, and then they borrowed too much money, and then they showed up to the king and started rioting, being like, hey, we owe too much money, and then the king would come out and say, I forgive all the debts, and they would have a giant party. That's what the Jubilee was. So this goes back. Yeah, this goes back to ancient times, where the cycle is that a currency starts out as a hard currency, where back in the day it might have been gold, it might have been pieces of food. I mean, like there are different things, and then eventually you end up with notes that are against the gold, because gold's inconvenient to actually trade in coins and whatnot, and then eventually it becomes fiat currency, which is where we went to when we switched off the gold standard, where the government has the ability to print it. And then when you have the ability to print it, you always print too much. And then it starts getting debased. And so if you're a small country and it gets debased, and sometimes things spiral out of control, and then you wind up having to reset, which is the last part of the cycle. You have runs on banks, and then the government has to be like, okay, you know this currency that's losing value? That's not it anymore. We're going back to a hard currency.
Gold standard.
And you can trust it because this time we're backing it up with something real, and then everyone's like, okay. So the issue with the U.S. right now is that no one knows where this particular cycle ends because you can't leave the dollar. And so this is one of the arguments he makes in his book that also blew my mind, was like, look, he goes through the world's currencies and is like, you know, the EU, like, too small and weak. The renminbi, like, you know, China has these weird currency controls. The yen, like, no one cares. Like, but it's like there is no other global reserve currency candidate that makes any sense. And so the U.S. is like, well, what are you going to do? Like, got to use a dollar because there's no place else to go. And this, in a way, to me, was the genesis of crypto, where people are casting about for an alternative to the dollar, and then, you know, wound up with Bitcoin, which starts out as essentially a digital version of gold. The other big alternative is gold itself, which Ray owns at least some gold. So that certainly made me think, like, listening to him talk, I was like, shit, and like, you know, like gold actually has like a more appealing case based on the conversation. So one of the issues with crypto, unfortunately, is that it's not clear whether it is truly hedging against currency risk, because it seems right now to correlate more with certain other assets, frankly, than
risk assets,
like risky assets, than it does like a basket of currencies. So the multi-trillion-dollar question is, what happens when you have a U.S. dollar global reserve currency that is being overproduced, shall we say, like, you know, that we're printing a lot of it, but you don't have any place to go. So the argument that Ray makes is that capital will find a place to go, that it's not obvious that there's another currency, but that it will leave the dollar if people sense the dollar is losing value.
What happened to modern monetary theory, or some of the stuff we talked about in the campaign, where as long as the federal government, U.S. government, is strong and pays its debt, and we can pretty much just, it's not real, we can just kind of have as much as we want. I'm blatantly oversimplifying modern monetary theory, but your thoughts on that now, and is that no longer the case? Were we wrong? Like, what's... You know, what are your thoughts?
So Ray's case is that you're looking at historical examples over and over again, and they always end up playing out similarly, which would, frankly, contradict modern monetary theory. If modern monetary theory does hold, then, you know, we're in a whole new era. But he makes a very, very convincing historical case that we've seen this movie before, and that there were two major global reserve currencies before us. The pound, when the UK owned 25% of the world and was running around and had its giant empire, which preceded ours immediately. And then before this, that I didn't know this, but apparently the Dutch guilder was the global reserve currency for a while, when like the Dutch traders ran everything.
Got it.
So his argument is that, you know, that we're going to go through some, and the scenarios he plays out, frankly, are very, very difficult and dark. But this does go back to the central political question at the time, which is what the heck do you do about inflation? Joe Biden recently announced his plan to combat inflation in an op-ed that was vastly panned, honestly, because he was in some ways pushing responsibility onto other actors, which in a way is totally legitimate, because there may be real limits to what he can do. But that's not exactly the plan people want to hear, where it's like, you know, you want something that the person can actually execute on. So the two other major players in this scenario are Congress and the Fed. And they may have more power over what happens in terms of inflation than anything Joe Biden can do, though no one wants to necessarily hear that.
It's so funny how I can even say the difference between when he ran for mayor and when he ran for president, in terms of how many people care about the president, and they're so passionate, and they identify with the president as a role. And, it's the running joke, blame Obama or blame whoever you want, right, for various problems. But the reality is, and we live it and seeing it right now, is that the president has only a few levers to pull, and the reality is they're pretty subject to macroeconomic forces, our economy in general, and what Congress can or can't or won't do. And what's your outlook on both inflation and our economy in general? I'm assuming we're heading towards a recession. I guess we're in it right now. I think it sounds like you're saying this gets worse before it gets better. How much worse does it get?
I've now spoken to a number of leading investors. So David Rubenstein was on the podcast.
Yeah.
Ray's obviously in this category. And I've talked to some other figures who maybe aren't quite as prominent or famous. The theme they keep pointing out is, look, you're going to have to raise interest rates in order for inflation to come down at all. And if you do raise interest rates, which have been anomalously low for an extended period of time, in a way that's essentially unique in
Right.
modern history, if you raise interest rates significantly, the current stock market valuations do not make any sense because they're getting discounted forward with like a very, very low time value of money. So if you jack up the time value of money, then a lot of tech companies' valuations don't make sense. A lot of growth companies' valuations don't make sense. So you wind up with a stock market correction of a very, very significant nature, and then you wind up with a recession of some kind. And I do not see any way out of this. I think we're going to end up with a very significant recession, and the adjustments are going to be deeply, deeply painful. Have you ever heard of data brokers? Well, they've heard of you. They are the middlemen that collect and sell the digital footprints that you leave online. They make detailed profiles, and then they sell your browsing history and your online searches, even your location data, to any company that wants to target you. Does this sound like a good time? It doesn't sound like a good time to me. And one way to protect yourself is to do what I do and use ExpressVPN. It's one of the easiest ways to get your own data under your control. When you're connected to ExpressVPN, your IP address is hidden. High-end corporations use this for their people. It encrypts 100% of network traffic to keep your data safe. So make sure your online activity and data are protected with the best VPN money can buy. Visit expressvpn.com/yang right now and get 3 extra months free through my special link. That's expressvpn.com/yang. expressvpn.com/yang to learn more.
For at least from my perspective and what I'm studying, my limited amount of study from learning on Wall Street, is that those guys like the Warren Buffetts and the Ray Dalios of the world, they don't seem that their timing is sometimes wrong, but over time, at least from what I've seen, they're never really wrong. Because always there's some greedy investor like, things are changing, this is different, you don't understand Amazon, and they're like, you can value it X, Y, Z, and then eventually it all comes back down to earth, and then your Ray Dalios of the world are like, I told you so. I guess my real question is, I don't think I got an answer from you on like modern monetary theory or like Ray Dalio's right, if you're looking at these two camps. Like, I'm assuming you're on the side of Ray's probably right, and the currencies are, we're going to have a currency issue pretty soon.
I will say that Ray makes a very, very compelling case based upon not decades, but centuries of history.
Yeah,
like he goes way back. And so imagine this too. Imagine that you ran a $200 billion hedge fund. He literally has an army of researchers who can pull up just about anything. So this book is literally like 400, like 50 pages or something along those lines. Did Ray Dalio sit there and write 450 pages? Of course not. Like it's filled with data sets and tables.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because he has like an army of people being like, hey, I'm going to pull up.
Crank out a report here.
I'm going to pull up a report on the Dutch guilder or whatever, and you can see how it like relates to gold.
Got it.
So there's so much data in here that if you respect data at all, you look at this and you're like, well, like it's essentially inarguable. like if you
nailed it.
It's like a 450 page argument that's documented back hundreds of years. So it's very hard to look at this and be like, yeah, this guy's, somehow barking at the wind. It's hard to compute that.
It's one of the things where like theoretically anybody can invest in the stock market, right? You and I, Zach, Joe Schmuck can buy Apple and buy these things and try and play the game and be a smart investor. But the difference that the inherent advantages that these institutional investors have, like the average investor, the average person cannot wrap their mind around. And what I mean by that, I remember because I used to talk to research analysts all the time. For example, I think it was Apollo or sorry, it was BlackRock or one of the big private equity shops. And they were like, Blackstone, and they were like, the reason people think they know where the market's going and this, that, and the other thing, we know where the market is right now because we know how many sandwiches Subway sold yesterday. Like, we know this real-time data of what's going on. We know how many packages of X that Amazon has sold, whatever it is. And that's data that the average human doesn't have or doesn't have the manpower to actually, sift through. So usually these, these investors that stood the test of time and they're looking at the numbers, they're usually directionally accurate,
So one of the things that came out just the last several days was that Elon Musk said there's something very, very bad brewing in the economy. Jamie Dimon says that there is a hurricane coming. You should brace yourself. We just don't know what size the hurricane is. And then Joe Biden got asked about this and then said, well, Intel's hiring, Ford's hiring, economy's strong, economy's good, fundamentals are good, et cetera. And one of the major problems we have in American life today is that everyone needs to talk up their case. It's because there's so many people right now that are in the administration or around the administration who are essentially making a bullish case for various things. And you can point to various measurements and say, oh, job growth's up. There are different things that are happening. I mean, right now, essentially 70% of Americans are not pleased with the direction because they just look at the price of gas and then that's that's
Inflation
day-to-day life and it's tough. But you have different people whose interest, and the thing is if I were Joe Biden, you do have to make a positive case
for
because
sure.
And the rest of it. So that's one of the struggles is we've essentially politicized what's going on in the economy.
Yes.
And Derek Thompson, when I interviewed him, talked about how your perception of the economy is actually very much partisan.
Yep.
It just depends on how you feel about who's in office. So the people who don't like Joe Biden and the Democrats think the economy's super terrible, and then Joe and the Democrats will talk about how there are some bright spots. So one of the reasons why I want to talk about this is for the folks who listen to me, Andrew Yang thinks that there are some very, very, very ominous dark clouds and weaknesses coming on a scale that we have not seen in quite some time, and so please do act accordingly. If you have assets out there that you feel frankly are kind of at risk, or things that you might need over some period of weeks or months. I personally would say, you might want to bring those assets in, do something because I think that if you hear Ray Dalio and Jamie Dimon and Elon all say something, to me it's and by the way, my intuition is also very much heading in that direction.
Right.
That, and this isn't a partisan thing. This is just I think shit's going to get nasty. I think really dark and nasty.
In the spirit of more positive news, Ray also talks about in his book essentially a 30% chance of a civil war or civil unrest in the United States.
He said civil war.
He said civil war. Yeah.
Stage 6 is what he calls it.
Jesus.
That we're in stage 5 of 6.
And was it tied to the economy or just simply because of polarization and this changing world order?
So just like there's a mega credit cycle that has 6 stages, apparently there's an internal order disorder cycle that has 6 stages. And it's tied to public use of resources. So there's a peace and prosperity phase in stage 3, and then stage 4 involves excess debt and unproductive use of resources. Stage 5, which we're in right now, is called the decline, where you have internal conflicts and debt problems. And then stage 6 is civil war / unrest. And during my interview with him, I said to him, it's hey, Ray, you said in your book 30% chance. I mean, that's staggeringly high. And he was like, oh, it's higher now.
Oh, God.
Because he wrote this probably, 12, 18 months ago. And this is also a mega cycle that takes a number of decades. Mm-hmm. He talked about what you would need to counteract it. Said that there are 2 types of outcomes. The more likely outcome is nasty populist type strongman figure. And then the benign case is what he called the strong peacemaker. but when he looked throughout history, he found very few examples of the strong peacemaker.
More nasty populist.
That is, you're more likely to wind up with the nasty populist. And he made this very dramatic argument that I thought was incredibly important, which is that we need to reform capitalism because it's not working for the bottom 60% of Americans. And he said this publicly when I was running for president. I was like, oh my gosh, like Dalio's on board with something dramatic, which he is. And he recommends that you have essentially a bipartisan Manhattan Project trying to fix the economy so that it works for the bottom 60% of Americans. And he thought it was an open question whether the path to get there is that somehow the two parties get their shit together and start collaborating and do something bipartisan, which we all know is highly unlikely, and we can talk about that, or that there's a political realignment, which is what the Forward Party and I are trying to make happen.
Right.
But that this is the second of the two mega cycles, which also says something very, very pessimistic. And his diagnosis of it was very familiar to anyone who's watching, where he's like, polarization, record highs, trust in institutions, record lows, like everything gets politicized, people don't know what the truth is, et cetera, et cetera. So great challenges in terms of the internal order-disorder cycle.
Right.
And then the third mega cycle is the rise and rivalry of different great powers. And so in his view, the U.S. is in relative decline and China is ascending, and that there's going to be increased friction between those two powers.
This book is a bit terrifying, Andrew. De-risk all your assets, buy a bunker.
Or at least, just bring them in. Like just be,
my God.
Or just, like prepare for some not great things. Which, if you listen to me, I mean,
We've been saying shit like this.
Yeah. I mean, I've been on this page. I'm still optimistic and can do, which, I want people to be, but also have a clear-eyed view. Like there are times when, you want to take risks and time when you want to take a bit less risk. And I'd say this is probably going to be one of the latter.
Well, it's one of the things I think most people are frustrated, and I'm personally frustrated, where you see all this stuff happening, like it's all declining, it's all going this, and then you feel like you can't do anything. That's probably a good way to segue into, I want to talk about some of the shootings that are happening. We haven't had the chance to talk about it on the podcast yet, where it's been going on for ages, but the most recent one's tragic shooting in Buffalo, and then an even worse one in an elementary school in Texas, which seems awful. And now it seems since then we have another shooting every day, or multiple per day. Do you mind breaking this down? The answer to this question, Andrew, is that, and like a real answer, like an Andrew Yang answer, not like, because Congress is polarized. I'd be like, break this down. Like, we all are generally agreed that this is terrible, yet nothing ever gets done. Like, we don't change it. And like someone will be like, it's the NRA, it's the Republicans, it's special interests, but like, can you break that down for me? For us?
I do think the political incentives are very clear and very stark. Where there was a Republican member of Congress represented Buffalo district, and he came out against
Chris Jacobs.
He came out against assault weapons, which, by the way, frankly, if people get killed by an assault weapon in your district, I would say
pretty rational move.
Like very human type stance, and then took so much heat and abuse and outrage that he said, hey, I'm not running for Congress, which he was planning to do. So do you think other Republican members of Congress saw that? Of course. They saw that and were like, well, I guess that's what happened. And again, this person represented the community directly.
Yes.
So if you represent another district and you raise your hand and say, hey, I also think that we should look at banning certain types of weapons that right now are illegal, what do you think is going to happen to you? Probably the same or worse as happened to Congressman Jacobs.
And he was essentially told, like, hey, you go out against this, we're going to outflank you from the right. We're going to run against you on the platform that you're weak on guns. And he said a number of things publicly, but big ones like there's going to be tens of millions of dollars pumped into my community talking about why we need AR-15s or assault, weapons or whatever the heck I'm arguing against. And that's divisive and awful and not what the community needs, so I'm going to resign. That's essentially...
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got a call from someone who works in Los Angeles. They said that they were getting calls as to what they could do to help. And they said the single biggest move you could make that might help make Congress responsive to this or anything else would be to shift to open primaries. Because if you have a closed party primary like Congressman Jacobs goes through,
Right.
then he looks at it and says, hey, I'm either going to lose or this is going to be terrible. There's no way in which this primary does not become terrible, so I am going to resign. If you had it so that everyone in his district votes on his reelection,
Yep.
what percentage of people in Buffalo right now are open to a move like that? I'm going to suggest it's it's probably pretty high. It's certainly much higher than the proportion of the Republican primary electorate in Buffalo. And so this person who called me made the case, which I agree with, is that, look, if there's one thing you want to change, it's the party primary system.
Yes.
And so this person then is directing resources to try and shift to open primaries, so that, look, that's actually the answer. And by the way, what I'm saying right now doesn't apply just to this issue. It applies to just about any very, very fraught or divisive issue in the country, where you're going to have some people who are very, very passionate on one end or the other, and then most people will look at it and say, hey, there probably is some reasonable middle ground that most of us would like to land on, but we're never going to get there because a lot of people will lose their job if they compromise, and so there is no compromise. This is the fundamental argument of the Forward Party, which is, look, politicians will do whatever their incentives are. And so if their incentives are to stay in their corner and say, hey, no, I'm not going to do anything because if I do something, I lose my job, like this congressman just did, then guess what? They're not going to do anything.
Right.
And so all of the frustration, passion, anger, sadness should be directed towards shifting to open primaries, because if there's no change in incentives, then there's no reason why we're going to see different responses now than we saw after any other of a number of episodes.
So right now you have House Democrats can get a bill through, but the Senate can't because it's 50-50 in the Senate with Kamala Harris as a tying vote, but you need 60 senators to get something to vote.
Through the filibuster.
So that's your issue, right? There are Republican senators who are on board with this a bit. So they're trying to find something to compromise on. President Biden has suggested banning assault weapons, raising the age to 21, background checks, storage laws and red flag laws, holding manufacturers accountable, which is probably the toughest one to actually execute, and then the mental health crisis, that's the toughest one to execute on because it's so dynamic. But let's just say we could pass laws that would work here. What would work? I'm curious your perspective on the actual policies.
I think raising the age limit makes a world of sense.
Yep.
I think that 18-year-olds' brains are at a particular moment, and it's different than a 21-year-old's brains.
Yep.
And by the way, what is one consistent fact pattern that we're concerned about? School shooters.
Yes.
And so
that's the big one.
And so is someone who's literally a junior or senior in high school, more prone to go to that school? Obviously. And so that seems like something. One of the things I'm discouraged by is apparently what strikes me as a very reasonable move of just 3 years for owning an automatic weapon. It seems like Republicans don't like that move,
right?
Even though that move strikes me as right in the heart of, okay, that would actually make a difference. This is a clear example of where if you had a rational political system where people could come together and say, look, we can agree on some common sense measures and let's land here and draw this line, and people would look at that and say, okay,
right,
that's reasonable. That's not the system we have. I mean, the question now is, what can you get 10 Republican senators to agree on? And we're going to find out.
At least when I was growing up, these debates on the polarizing issues used to be really interesting because you could debate the policies and what will work, and the gun control debate's fascinating.
One of the major things now is that people are just it doesn't fucking matter.
That's the thing.
Nothing's going to pass.
It doesn't matter. There's no point in debating what would the best effective gun measure.
But this is the argument I'm making too, is that people are waking up to the fact that this system's totally dysfunctional, and our agreements or disagreements are increasingly irrelevant in the face of what we're seeing. And so this is, by the way, I think this is going to bite the Democrats in the ass in November, which I guess everyone knows. When there's a failure in something, and so the one that was top of mind until very recently was women's reproductive rights and Roe v. Wade being overturned. Yeah. And a woman said to me that you did not see this firestorm of protest among certain groups, certain communities. Frankly, a lot of suburban women, where the Democrats would look up and say, okay, it's go time. Like, let's go fight for women's reproductive rights. And they did not see a giant influx of donations. They did not see an influx of support or activism. And I talked to some people who were within this community, and they're just ticked off at the Democrats for mismanaging this, botching it, getting played, et cetera. And so when these things are happening, when the Democrats are raising their hands and say, it's time to fight for this and that, like more and more people are just being like, you can't do it. The system is broken. There's nothing that can be done, which, by the way, is a case that I have been making via the Forward Party for a while, but that this is materializing in front of us. And I'm going to cautiously say that the fact that people are waking up to the realities of our dysfunctional political system may be a good thing.
That's our silver lining right there.
Yeah, that like, and one of the arguments I'm making too is like, look, you're being played, you're being manipulated.
Yes.
Like $14 billion went into both parties over the last cycle, essentially pissing us off at each other. And like, and by the way, you know how much got spent in opposition? Essentially all 14 billion. It was like almost 7 billion on one side and 7 billion on the other. So you have these waves of resources, and where does it go? Essentially nowhere.
Yep.
And so then when someone gets up and says like, hey, like this stuff is going poorly, like, we need more and more people are like, no, like that, like this stuff is not working. Like the system is not going to result in anything positive. And that's savvy. So the argument I'm making is, look, if you have 14 billion being spent within the system that's leading us nowhere good, how much should actually be spent on reforming the system?
Yeah.
If you had to put a dollar figure on it, and I'm going to suggest that number's in the billions.
Yep.
And so if you had like the equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar and also giant popular movement towards trying to reform the system, that's actually the answer for a lot of the problems I'm describing right now. Whether it's poverty and inflation, whether it's guns, whether it's social issues. I mean, you name it. Because most of us actually are willing to look at it and be like, okay, look, I'm on one side, you're on the other side. Like, let's compromise on something that we can all be a little unhappy with and go from there. But that's not what the system is producing.
That's probably the silver lining where I'm a big believer that elections are about macro issues and usually not micro issues, unless your micro issue is really, really bad to the point where it becomes a macro issue. Like if you're seeing the world crumbling, if you will, the country crumbling, and just straight up no action, then you begin to say, well, it becomes a little more obvious to the casual observer that it's a system problem. And that is probably good for the Forward Party. And what the challenge is,
and genuine structural reform.
Yes, and it'll be good. It's one of the things I love about the Forward Party is that there theoretically will be someone and multiple someones to do kind of what you did in the presidential, was like raise your hand, like, hey, it's actually the system that's busted here, and it's like what you're two talking about, like it's stupid on both sides and it actually doesn't matter. And you're right. That's the other thing. The truth usually will scale here because you're right, and over time, like this is already panning out and will continue to pan out because we have a school shooting. Everybody's pissed off and heartbroken and just angry, and then nothing gets done. You saw it with George Floyd. We saw it with Roe v. Wade. We saw it with the school shooting. We're going to see it with climate change. We're going to see it with Wall Street being corrupt in 2008, where CEOs get paid and no one goes to jail. Like, you get it on the list. People are angry about something, another happened. Eventually, I think they'll get fed up. I think two things happen. You either get fed up or you get it, or you ignore it.
Well, one of the things I'd say is, like, if people who take a step back and check out on this stuff, like, I totally get it. I mean, it's like, why would you willingly allow yourself to be upset all the time?
Yeah. I spent some time with some family over Memorial Day weekend, and the husband and wife were in two different camps. One was, like, radicalized to one side. I'll just ignore it so they don't share their belief. But they're one side where the other party was evil, and this is what I'm passionate about. I got really, really passionate. And then the other side, in this case, the husband was just tuned out. Just anytime his wife brought it up, he's like walking out of the room. I'm not talking politics. And that, to me, was like America in a nutshell, in a way. Like, we've either become really, really angry about something and we've tried to help, or we're just like, F this. I'm going to go down my own and do my own thing and not care about it. And you could argue both are somewhat equally destructive in a way. Where,
one of the arguments I made months ago, which I still believe, is that we are slumping towards autocracy.
You tweet that? That's fun.
I
Slumping. Tell me what you mean by that.
It's just that we're trending towards authoritarianism, And then when someone tries to be like, hey, no, get up and fight like this, everyone will be like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Like that. That's the general direction we're heading.
We had this learning when we were running for president where, Trump was such a good example of this, but it was what you call it, the post-inspirational America, where Obama ran on hope and change. People were so passionate, so idealistic about what we could do. And then he could only do what he could in this busted system. And to the point where like the platitudes were just worthless. Like you could say, we're gonna change the world.
I will say
we're
this
inspire.
as someone who did vote for Obama.
Yeah.
When I see him show up in my Netflix queue, I'm like actively discouraged or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just like, this is where we are now.
Like you mean him as a Hollywood producer?
Oh, so he just shows up and like, he's like.
He's a mythical figure at this point to me.
But he's getting, and this is maybe my biggest beef with Obama. Is that like he truly was president as cultural figure, and he's still a cultural figure, but I'm not sure that's what we need right now. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Well, if you're Obama, what can you do?
Like we don't need good content, is what I'm saying. It's like we don't. It's like we'll. And this is, but I really did like American Factory. Like I liked, but it's like that shit will not set us free at this point. I mean, you have like you have the system that's just freaking overrun with cash in various ways, and then the cash is made by inflaming us in various directions. And so being a practical sort, I'm like, okay, you know what we need? We need cash that rewards
logical thinking.
Yeah, like like depolarizing messages and behaviors and the rest of it. And which, maybe that's
no, I think if I was at this, if I was a billionaire right now, I would spend, it sounds dark, but I probably would look to buy the system out for good, which obviously who am I to say that, but you look to go kind of what Bloomberg tried to do, because the only way to do is pour money into like the broken system. So either democracy reform or you're just straight up buying senators and congressmen and women who are on board with your policies.
I propose a legislator liberation fund, which is that we will buy you out of your contract with the major party. Like, what did you spend in the last cycle? $20 million.
Yes.
We will give you that plus 50%, so $30 million to join this.
To be a rational human being.
Yeah, to be an independent, essentially. Yes. You could just go down the line and buy. I actually, believe it or not, everyone, I priced this out. Like you
what is it, a couple billion?
It's less. It's not even that much.
Because you don't need that many senators.
You could buy out 4 U.S. senators from their contracts with their parties for less than $200 million.
I'm assuming you're making this pitch.
Is this a real pitch? Yeah, this is a real pitch.
This should be a pitch. It's a good pitch. Okay, so I think I've said this on the podcast before. I talked to someone who used to be very, very senior at the World Bank, and I was at my former job on Wall Street, and she asked all of our big clients at like a small dinner we were having, like, if you had all the money in the world to solve a social problem, what would you do? And people were like, education, this, and then I flipped it on her. I'm like, what would you do? And she said, I would get it in cash and use it to pay off the bribe people for good. Because she's like, most of the world's problem. This is a bigger problem internationally, but it's a big problem in the United States too, where it's all about the money. So it goes like the decisions that are made, whether they help people or hurt people, are made, frankly, for the highest bidder. And we learned that when we ran. It's like, don't kid yourself. It's all a money game. It's all a money game.
So I want to try and unlock a critical mass of resources to do what I'm describing.
Yeah,
it's good fun.
Mm-hmm.
I'm enjoying it. We're
it's a worthy fight for sure.
I mean, we're in the like 7 figures, so like
you're cranking.
Yeah,
Forward Party's cranking, and and the other thing is you guys will unlock other. Like they may be like, oh, I don't know about the Forward Party, but I do believe in the ideas. So here's a Forward Party competitor or whatever. Like I'm sure you'll see that nonsense too, but that's good. You normalize what you're talking about. Ideally, we all line up. But
well, I mean, I see, like you said, if you were a billionaire, let's say Andrew Yang was a billionaire, right. which by the way, everyone knows. I mean, it's like laughable. The
according to the press, you were for a little bit.
That would be great stuff. But like, would I fund a legislator liberation fund? Sure. Would I go around and you could do a lot of good in this direction. And one of my frustrations with a couple of people who've tiptoed in this direction. So here are these people: Ross Perot, Howard Schultz, Mike Bloomberg, where when they did their thing, they didn't then turn around and invest in the deep structural reform.
They left pissed off.
Yeah, and it's like, look, the process sucks. Get it. I've actually been through versions of it. But let's do the entrepreneur thing and like build the alternative and like build the counter set of incentives. And there hasn't been that appetite, but the appetite's returning because everyone sees how screwed up the current system is.
Yeah.
So that's again, we earlier in this conversation said, look, 14 billion got spent within the system. How much is getting spent to reform the system?
Yeah.
If we spent $1 billion trying to reform the system, we'd do a ton of good.
Yep. So AOC, I think it was on Twitter. I saw it on Twitter. I don't know if she did it on like Instagram Live or something, but I don't always agree with her on a lot of things. But she said something that resonated with me. She said it's really, really difficult to operate in a system that's fundamentally corrupt. And it's one of the things you notice too. He's like, I could go into Congress and I'm not going to be able to do shit.
Because and then I just get reduced to like a freaking off-Broadway theater performer, which is what like most of them become. But this is also an argument that really fueled the origin of the Forward Party. Is that Ezra Klein said toxic systems compromise good individuals with ease.
Yeah,
and
with ease.
And he was making that argument like it's a toxic system.
Yes,
like we got to clean the system up. One of the fascinating elements is like we gotta we're gonna need money to clean the system up. So like I'm trying to get righteous money, which is fun. And there actually are people who I believe fall in this category, including, people who are listening to this who've given us $10. I mean, that's righteous money.
We're righteous money. Grassroots dollars are usually
that's the most righteous.
Yeah,
but I will say to you all,
because no one feels like it's my, I don't know.
I will say to you all, though, we're going to need a combination of like grassroots and some other stuff.
Yeah, you need more than, because that's the thing. Let's call Bernie the king of grassroots funding, right? What's he raised over all the elections? 200 million? All in, maybe. I'm probably being.
And this is another thing. One of my more controversial tweets or whatever. I was like, Bernie should have started a third party, which I, by the way, totally believe.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And there are a lot of people who were part of the Bernie movement who wanted him to.
Yes.
And I don't know why he didn't, but he would have had a shot at it. So we're going to close this convo on an uplifting note. So Zach, how has it been being a published author over the last couple of weeks?
That's not bad, man. I will say, I think I've talked about this on the podcast. Like, books are an interesting thing to be selling. I think I've met a lot of first-time authors, and I worked with you very closely when you were a second-time author, and pretty closely when you're a third author. But I would say a lot of authors have that ambition that they're going to sell lots of books and they'll light the world on fire and be a New York Times bestseller. I had none of those ambitions. But I will say, for those of you who have, a lot of you have reached out, both to me personally or on social media, saying, I read the book and I love it. That's been nice to hear.
It's a great book. If you haven't picked it up, everyone, Long Shot, How Political Nobodies Made Andrew Yang President of the United States.
It's more uplifting. It's more uplifting than Ray's book, it sounds like. But I didn't have a research team. I had to do that shit myself.
It also is more fun and readable and cinematic than my book. So
that's true. It's more of a narrative. We're trying to make a movie out of it in a way.
Yeah. So if you wanted to see essentially like a movie screenplay about like the Madcap Yang campaign, check out Long Shot. And as someone who's written a few books, the frame I put myself in after the first book was like, look, as long as like you are happy with what you produced and that people you respect say to you like, hey, good job, then you're golden.
Yeah,
like that's pretty much like
that. Yeah, there's people who have read it that I like and trust. Are like, I really enjoyed this. Like, and they'll say like, look, I would tell you, but I enjoyed it. That's good.
So on this topic,
yeah,
it is now the beginning of summer, and what content recommendations?
Summer content recs.
Yes, I have some.
I just finished the first part of season 4 of Stranger Things. You watch Stranger Things?
Yes.
I fucking love Stranger Things. I think it's well done. And I didn't love this season the whole time. That was a little dramatic. And then I thought they ended. You watch the newest one? I thought they ended it really well. And they closed a bunch of a lot of loopholes from the first season, like kind of stuff you've been having throughout. So
I'm going to match your Stranger Things and raise you with The Boys season 3.
I haven't watched it yet. It's good?
Yeah, it's really good.
The Boys are good. I mean, it's dark, but
it's messed up, but it's messed up in that delightful
fun,
boys way,
hilarious way. Yeah, for those of you who haven't heard of The Boys, it's on Amazon. It's about, I guess, like if you had superheroes if you had real superheroes in the world of capitalism.
There is a lot of capitalism critique going on.
It's like Watchmen, but that is less dark than Watchmen, and it's a little more realistic, right?
I mean, it's a great watch.
Yeah, it's good.
The boys, check it out. I'm going to go with a couple of deep cuts for people.
Throw it out there, man. Summer content.
Also from Amazon Prime, if you like The Boys, there is an animated series called Invincible.
Oh, I saw. It's good.
I
saw ads for this.
That's excellent.
Oh, really?
It's really, really good.
All right.
So also, I mean, like Stephen Yeun, who I'm friends with, is like the lead voice actor in Invincible.
Fun.
Invincible is just a great freaking show. If you like The Boys and you want more like that, the Invincible's in some ways almost like an animated version of The Boys. Also on Amazon Prime, also super enjoyable, Reacher.
So Jack Reacher,
Reacher. I think it's called Reacher, but there's a giant blonde dude now.
It's a Tom Cruise movie turned into a series, right?
Yes. So it's based on a series of books.
Right.
This show is really fun and watchable. So if you have Amazon Prime, after you get through The Boys, Invincible, and Reacher, both really, really like high quality in my opinion. Really good watches.
I finished Ozark. It's good. Last season, really good. I love Jason. I've always liked Jason Bateman. Laura Linney's really talented. She's annoying in this show, but she's supposed to be.
Brown University grad. I don't know if you.
Is she really?
Yeah.
Nice. That's one of two actors coming out of Brown. How many actors come out of Brown?
A lot of people come out of Brown.
Really?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people, talented people come out of Brown. I didn't know. I guess you've got a creative.
Probably the most famous, Emma Watson.
She's a Brown grad.
Yeah.
All right. I'm watching two things right now. I'm watching The Last Kingdom, which is on Netflix now, which I've heard is really good. I haven't gotten into it yet. I'm going to probably get into Marvel, and that's my brother wants me to get into, or like the Disney Plus Marvel series. So that's, WandaVision and Loki and...
Mixed bag, honestly.
Are they? I've heard it's
so
mixed bag.
I was a comic book nerd growing up, so I've seen all the Marvel stuff.
Okay.
And it's a mixed bag.
Okay.
I'm not going to lie. But on Netflix, another deep cut that so it's funny, is like I was looking for stuff I could watch with my sons, and it turns out that this was too dark for them. But it's called Arcane. It's based upon a video game, an animated series, and it's freaking excellent. Like it's
too dark for the young
beautiful.
boy.
Yeah, it was funny. It's like I was looking for something we could watch as a family,
Got
and then it ends up being me and Evelyn watching it. But it's nuanced narratives, great characters, Arcane. If you like that kind of thing, it's kind of got an anime style.
Okay. So Carly, my fiance, is obsessed with the show Gilmore Girls. So I've been begged to watch this show many, many times. So I've eventually caved. And now I use it as like, if she's mad at me, I'll be like, we could just watch Gilmore Girls, right? And that has earned me some points. But I will say, it's not bad. It's actually not bad. At least this usually has pretty witty dialogue. I'd argue the lead actresses are pretty talented. I've watched a lot of Gilmore Girls, and I don't know if I want to say that.
That's feel good, man. Plus,
it is feel good. It's generally feel good. But it's funny because it's shot back when shows were done like in a studio and you wouldn't binge watch them, So it was like, 1 hour episodes, 20 episodes a season. So there's a lot of it.
I mean, I like watching that stuff because I remember, not that I saw that in real time, but just times were simpler at a particular point.
Yeah.
You know
it's like,
I mean?
I haven't gone back and watched the OC, but I imagine that was
the show that is associated the most in my mind with a simpler time is Friends.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like the entire dating life in your 20s in New York City or whatever. It's like, I was watching that shit when I was in college, and then I moved here, and then it was like, that's what you imagine life's going to be like.
And it's totally not, but it's simple.
But it was simple, simpler times.
There's your Rex, folks.
Plus, both Zach and I need to get out there and see Top Gun as our patriotic duty.
You got to see it. I've heard, all right, so I've had a number of friends be like, Top Gun's sick, Top Gun's sick. My family said Top Gun's sick. The fact that anyone could ever in the same sentence say the new Top Gun is as good, if not possibly better than the original, that may not be true, but the fact that they could say it without sounding like an idiot means it's probably pretty awesome.
It is your patriotic duty to go out and see Top Gun, coming from a guy who has not seen it yet. But that's a fine way to close
I'm going to see it, I think,
this episode. Let's get our summers on. And look, things are challenging out there, but just look outside, look in your loved ones' faces. The sun is shining. Life is good. So let's get out and enjoy it.
Later, y'all.